Fellow South Africans, our beloved Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, the founding president of our democratic nation, has departed. He passed on peacefully in the company of his family around 2050 on the 5th of December 2013. He is now resting. He is now at peace. Our nation has lost its greatest son. Our people have lost a father. Although we knew that this day would come, nothing can diminish our sense of a profound and enduring loss. His tireless struggle for freedom earned him the respect of the world. His humility, his compassion, and his humanity earned him their love. Our thoughts and prayers are with the Mandela family. To them, we owe a debt of gratitude. They have sacrificed much and endured much so that our people could be free. Our thoughts are with his wife, Mrs. Graça Machel, his former wife, Miss Winnie Madikizela Mandela, with his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, and the entire family. Our thoughts are with his friends, comrades, and colleagues who fought alongside Madiba over the cause of a lifetime of struggle.
When a man has done what he considers to be his duty to his people and his country, he can rest in peace. I believe I have made that effort. And that is therefore why I will sleep for the eternity.
Nelson Mandela, who led the emancipation of South Africa from white minority rule and served as his country's first black president, became an international symbol of dignity and forbearance. Mr. Mandela's quest for freedom led from the court of tribal royalty to the Liberation Underground, to a prison rock quarry, and finally to the presidential suite of Africa's wealthiest country.
The central goal was that South Africa would be ruled by South Africans. It was the cause of his life, and he achieved it.
Mandela first came to the world's attention while serving a life prison sentence for sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the state. He would become the personification of opposition to South Africa's brutal apartheid regime.
Apartheid was a system that was set up by the National Party government, an extremely formal race-based division of the country. Apartheid literally in the Afrikaans language means apartness. It means that the races were not meant to live together.
In the early 1960s, Mandela led the ANC, the African National Congress, on a road of armed insurrection against the apartheid regime. It would lead to his eventual arrest on charges of conspiracy to overthrow the state. Mandela's legend grew when he arrived at his trial wearing traditional Xhosa leopard skin garb to underscore that he was an African entering a white man's jurisdiction. Mandela's courtroom speech was one of the most eloquent of his life.
I have cherished
the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an idea for which I hope to live for. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
The South African government of Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd was under pressure from liberals at home and abroad to spare the defendants. Nevertheless, the judge sentenced them to life in prison.
The sentence in the case of all the accused will be one of life imprisonment. As your lord. Very well, the court will then adjourn.
Nelson Mandela was 44 when he was sentenced to hard labor at South Africa's notorious Robben Island prison.
They were placed in small cells. They did manual labor. They walked off every day to these limestone quarries where they smashed up limestone that would be used to build highways, roads.
Under the National Party's rule, ethnic clashes and violence were rampant. In Mandela's view, by the mid-'80s, the enemy was already morally and politically defeated. His strategy, he said, was to give the white rulers every chance to retreat in an orderly way. Mr. Mandela's decision to begin direct and secret negotiations with the white government was one of the most momentous of his life. He made it without consulting his comrades in the African National Congress, knowing full well they would resist. He was released from prison in 1990, at the age of 71. Bill Keller was the New York Times South Africa bureau chief from 1992 to 1995.
It was clearly an electrifying moment. You know, again, it was a symbolic moment because a lot of the important stuff had already happened before then. He'd been negotiating literally for years the terms of a deal that would legalize the opposition parties and begin the process of democratizing South Africa. But that was the moment when I think, you know, just in everybody's minds, they just said, oh my God, it's real.
I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant.
The South Africa that he walked out into was kind of a mess. I mean, it was the campaign against apartheid had set itself a goal of making the country ungovernable, and to some extent they succeeded. The townships were erupting in violence, and everybody sort of knew that the established order was beginning to crumble, but nobody knew quite what was going to succeed it. So people were very, very anxious.
2 years after Mandela's release from prison, black and white leaders began negotiations that would lead to the end of white rule. All the while, extremists, black and white, continued to use violence to tilt the outcome their way, as Mr. Mandela and the white president, F.W. de Klerk, argued and maneuvered towards a peaceful transfer of power.
The key to the deal was the decision on the part of the ANC that they would share power for the initial stages of a new democracy, and that the president would have 2 deputy presidents from other parties who would participate in the governance of the country. Having established this constitution, they then had to prepare for something that South Africa had never seen, which was an honest-to-God election campaign in which most Africans got to participate. It was an amazing spectacle. He campaigned in white neighborhoods too and went to white events, but the unforgettable thing was to be in one of these small soccer stadiums in an African township. People sitting up on the tin roof, and then you sort of see this sort of dusty trail of cars approaching, and they'd arrive in the middle of the soccer field, and Mandela would get out, and the place would just erupt. And it was, you know, profoundly moving, I have to say. You know, again, elections are just the starting point of democracy, but there is something about watching people get this privilege who've been denied it for a long time that you know, you can't help but be moved.
The African National Congress won 62% of the vote, earning 252 of the 400 seats in Parliament, and ensuring that Mr. Mandela, as party leader, would be named president when the Parliament convened.
He had a cabinet that consisted of some of the people who had been his arch enemies. He didn't much like either of his deputy presidents. Thabo Mbeki, who succeeded him, was not Mandela's choice to be his successor. And F.W. de Klerk, who shared a Nobel Prize with Mandela. The two of them had a relationship that kind of seemed to veer between tolerance and loathing.
While Mandela disliked and blamed de Klerk for much of the trouble in South Africa, he did praise him for having the foresight to see the reality of the situation and for having the courage to face it. Many whites ended up despising de Klerk as a sellout.
His presidency was about inventing South Africa. Mandela realized that in order to govern this country, he had to win over some significant percentage of the whites. He had to at least reassure them that there was a place for them. That was their government too. And the vehicle that he chose for doing that was rugby. And rugby had been historically the Afrikaans sport, the white sport. Blacks didn't play rugby much. In their eye, it had become kind of a symbol of the oppressor's culture. So Mandela took it upon himself to embrace the Springboks, the national rugby team.
South Africa hosted the 1995 Rugby World Cup, and their national team was the Cinderella story of the tournament. They defeated New Zealand 15-12 in the finals.
Mandela came out to present the trophy, and you had this stadium full of mostly white Afrikaners, the former ruling race, chanting Mandela's name. His being there sent a message to white South Africans, and their reaction to him sent a message to black South Africans. So it was a singular moment.
The dimensions and effects of poverty are all too familiar. Hunger.
Having delivered the miracle of South Africa's freedom, it was perhaps too much to expect Mr. Mandela to deliver a second miracle of broad prosperity.
He came into office promising a lot in terms of economic advancement. They didn't deliver on those promises. They were probably unrealistic to some degree. You know, the trade-off was that they were not going to confiscate the wealth from whites, and they weren't going to confiscate the land from white landowners. You know, to this day, there's some debate in South Africa over whether or not they should have been more aggressive in doing that. The other side of that argument is look at Zimbabwe, where they did confiscate everything and destroyed their economic infrastructure in the process. You know, he fell short in a number of ways. For one thing, it was becoming clear at that point that South Africa had a devastating AIDS problem. It didn't get the attention that it really needed under Mandela's regime, and so he has to be faulted for that.
Later in life, Mandela spoke out about the need for safe sex and cheaper antiretroviral drugs. In 2005, he would share publicly that his eldest son had died of AIDS.
One of the most important things he did as president was step down, which is not a usual thing in new democracies.
When Mandela left the presidency in 1999, Thabo Mbeki, who was not his pick for successor, took over.
Post-presidency, he kept a very low profile, especially domestically. His successor was resentful whenever Mandela would speak out on anything political, and so out of respect for Thabo Mbeki and for the party, he only spoke out on things that he really cared about, like the AIDS issue.
As a former president, Mr. Mandela lent his charisma to a variety of African causes, joining peace talks to end several conflicts and helping his third wife, Grasu, raise money for children's aid organizations.
You know, people talk about Jimmy Carter being a better ex-president than a president. Mandela, in a funny way, is sort of the reverse. He did his most important work before he was president. I think Nelson Mandela will be remembered first and foremost for his courage and dignity and persistence. I think he deserves to be remembered as a man who made a free South Africa possible, and who did it by behaving not like a revolutionary, but like a politician, by sheer patient, disciplined compromise and negotiations.
It could so easily have been different. Can you imagine if he had been consumed by bitterness?
I don't think that in the last century there have been many people that could ever compete with the value and the profile of an individual like Nelson Mandela.
He has an authority that probably nobody else in the world has.
He will be an inspiration to people hundreds of years from now.
He's probably will be remembered as the greatest historical figure of this era.
Nelson Mandela's long walk, forever remembered. But it was the decision for the ANC to sponsor military action that started that very walk. This, his first ever television interview in 1961.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
Mandela was head of the armed wing of the ANC. He was arrested, charged, tried and sentenced to a life in jail. 27 years, many spent on Robben Island. He left behind his family and his friends.
People say, oh, what a waste, 27 years. And I have to say, no, I disagree. I disagree. When he went to jail, he was an angry young man. And it took the 27 years for him to mellow.
People did protest to end his incarceration. But for a long time, the right people didn't listen. And then, on his own terms, Nelson Mandela was released. And then, without even a trace of malice, he forgave his captors.
In prison, there have been men, who are very good in the sense that they understand our point of view, and they do everything to try and make you as happy as possible. And that has wiped out any bitterness which a man could have.
And so he looked forward, pressing for South Africa's first totally free, multiracial elections. Mandela and the man that set him free, Frederick de Klerk, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. They weren't always the best of friends, but they did achieve the first totally open and free election in their country. Now in charge of the ANC, Mandela campaigned for presidency in his now familiar manner, stressing reconciliation, forgiveness. Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa, not by force, but with a dance.
Never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
The country went on to host and then win the Rugby World Cup. A sport synonymous with whites. Now the crowd, if not the whole country, was chanting his name. Never has a politician been quite so popular in his lifetime. The first former prisoner to stay at Buckingham Palace, flirting with Ginger Spice.
You're not old, you're as young as the girl you feel, and I'm 25.
I'll take that up, yeah?
And then immortalised in a film directed by Clint Eastwood and starring the man Mandela chose to play him, Morgan Freeman.
Because in order to build our nation, we must all exceed our own expectations.
After one term as president, he retired. But such was his immense popularity, he was even forced to retire from retirement, reducing his public appearances, but letting people down gently.
Don't call me. I'll call you.
His 90th birthday was celebrated with a concert in London, but his life is littered with tragedy. One son died of AIDS, another in a car crash when he was still in jail, and his great-granddaughter, Zanani, was killed in a car crash on her way back from the World Cup opening party. He didn't face the crowds until the final.
There is an incredible amount of evil in the world. But you know what? There's also an incredible amount of good. And in the end, good will prevail.
Fellow South Africans, our beloved Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, the founding president of our democratic nation, has departed. He passed on peacefully in the company of his family around 2050 on the 5th of December.
At his trial in 1964, Nelson Mandela closed his statement from the dock saying, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." And Nelson Mandela lived for that ideal, and he made it real. He achieved more than could be expected of any man. And today he's gone home. And we've lost one of the most influential, courageous, and profoundly good human beings that any of us will share time with on this earth. He no longer belongs to us. He belongs to the ages. Through his fierce dignity and unbending will to sacrifice his own freedom for the freedom of others, Madiba transformed South Africa and moved all of us. His journey from a prisoner to a president embodied the promise that human beings and countries can change for the better. His commitment to transfer power and reconcile with those who jailed him set an example that all humanity should aspire to, whether in the lives of nations or our own personal lives. And the fact that he did it all with grace and good humor and an ability to acknowledge his own imperfections only makes the man that much more remarkable. As he once said, "I'm not a saint unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." I am one of the countless millions who drew inspiration from Nelson Mandela's life. My very first political action, the first thing I ever did that involved an issue or a policy or politics, was a protest against apartheid. I would study his words and his writings. The day he was released from prison gave me a sense of what human beings can do when they're guided by their hopes and not by their fears. And like so many around the globe, I cannot fully imagine my own life without the example that Nelson Mandela set. And so long as I live, I will do what I can to learn from him. To Gracia Michel and his family, Michelle and I extend our deepest sympathy and gratitude for sharing this extraordinary man with us. His life's work meant long days away from those who loved him most. And I only hope that the time spent with him these last few weeks brought peace and comfort to his family. To the people of South Africa, we draw strength from the example of renewal and reconciliation and resilience that you made real. A free South Africa at peace with itself. That's an example to the world. And that's Madiba's legacy to the nation that he loved. We will not likely see the likes of Nelson Mandela again. So it falls to us as best we can to forward the example that he set, to make decisions guided not by hate but by love, to never discount the difference that one person can make, to strive for a future that is worthy of his sacrifice. For now, let us pause and give thanks for the fact that Nelson Mandela lived, a man who took history in his hands and bent the arc of the moral universe towards justice. May God bless his memory and keep him in peace.